Before I start, I would like to make just two small remarks. Firstly, it is a joint research with my supervisor, Theoharis Grigoriadis. And secondly, I essentially had just started this project when I came here 2.5 months ago. So our results are very preliminary, and I would be very grateful for any comments or ideas what to do and how to improve that. And I will start with a little bit of my motivation to actually do this research, and this is totally an economist's motivation. There is namely a huge body of literature in economics which discusses how culture and institutions influence economic development. And there is also growing literature becoming very popular on how border changes influence culture, but also economies, and how the borders are persistent after they are being removed. For example, the paper by Grosfeld and Żurawska discusses the case of Poland, which was partitioned between the three empires, and how this former imperial borders still affect political and religious attitudes and some economic outcomes today. Another prominent case is, of course, that of Germany, with German division into Eastern and Western Germany. Interestingly, some research says once the border is removed, once Germany has been unified, it would take approximately, like the research essentially implies, that it would take approximately the same time to level out the difference that were installed by this division, also in social attitudes and political attitudes. So it would take as much time as it took actually to create these differences in the first place. So our interest is then based on these two research fields, and we ask, okay, if we have a region which was homogeneous in the first place, like Eastern Prussia was, and we divide it into different states, what happens? Can we, after a while, still see this Eastern Prussian region on a map of political attitudes, of cultural attitudes, of economy, after, like even today? And more broadly speaking, it is also the question of if there is some sort of trade-off between the nation building, having your own nation state, and regional ties that historically existed there. And I mean, geography didn't change, it is still a relatively small region, yes. In terms of economic geography, of how economic activity is distributed spatially, it is also the question of whether it's actually the place, the region by itself, the geography where it is located, or is it the agglomeration that existed there for a while, the networks and so on? Is it about the people? So what I'm going to talk about today is firstly, of course, the case of East Prussia per se, historically how it formed, how it fell, then our hypothesis, what we expected when we started to work on this project, then my data and approach and some preliminary results that I have. This is statistical analysis. I will try not to go too much into mathematics. Yes, and then if I have time, I will highlight a little bit what I wish to do next. So, looking at East Prussia, the German presence in the region dates back as early as the 13th century. This is when the order first came to the region. This is also when the replacement of population with the German population started, because through the wars the region became quite depopulated, especially in the eastern boundaries, which were in war for like 2 centuries approximately. Then the borders of the region were formed very much around the mid of the 15th century, and from mid-15th century to mid-17th century, Prussia was the domain of the Teutonic Order. After 1525, the Duchy under the Polish suzerainty. Well, they still had quite a lot of autonomy, and there was still very little Polish population, for example, coming in. It was predominantly a German region. In 1618, the duchy was inherited by the House of Brandenburg. 1660 is the independence from Poland, and in the early 18th century, the Frederick III of the House of Brandenburg was crowned as king in Prussia, Frederick I, and this is when Prussia and Brandenburg essentially merged into one single country, which was then renamed into Prussia, and what was originally Prussia became the province of East Prussia as we know today. And finally, in the end of the 18th century, the partitioning of Poland and after that the Napoleonic Wars set the borders of East Prussia as it stayed until the end of the First World War. So just as a brief outlook for you also to know where the region actually is I'm talking about. So the region of Eastern Prussia is somewhere here. The border of the province would be around here. So the eastern border was set as early as 1422. This border was set around mid-15th century. This part, Ermland, was Polish up to the Polish partitions. In the Polish partitions, Prussia actually gained quite some area here as well, but after the Napoleonic Wars it went to Russia. The Russian border shifted to the west. So in this state we see East Prussia as province of the state of Prussia and later of German Empire until the First World War. Now, from the very time of the unification of Brandenburg and Prussia, the creation of the Kingdom of Prussia, until the very end of the region, East Prussia was a stronghold of landowners and military aristocracy in Prussia and then the German Empire. This region was also very little affected by industrialization. It stayed highly agricultural region. It was also, as I showed here, the border with Russia was here, so only Königsberg rose a little bit as a trade center, partially for trading grain coming from Russia and moving it over the sea to other regions of Germany and outside of Germany, which directly leads to the next idea that the landowners in East Prussia faced very high competition from Russia in terms of what they produced. And it is then only logical that East Prussia was one of the major supporters of the Conservative Party, which in Europe is pretty much about defending traditional values, the Christian values, and also protectionism in trade. On the other hand, East Prussia was not that much affected by the national conflicts that were rising in the end of the 19th century due to the policy of Germanization in the German Empire. So nationalism was rising not only on the side of the Poles, who felt oppressed by the Kulturkampf of Bismarck, which was directed against the Catholic Church, but also the Germans felt like they were Polonized by the Polish in the eastern regions, so the nationalism was rising on the German side as well. This context is much more prominent in West Prussia and Pomerania, not that much in Eastern Prussia, partially because of composition of population that was there. So again, the border of East Prussia is around here. This is the region of West Prussia, this is Posen, and this is Silesia, right? And the green color is for the Poles, the red is for the Germans. You see that especially in West Prussia and Posen, right, and Silesia, you really have huge regions where Poles have a clear majority. Yes. This is not that much the case in East Prussia. So here in the northern parts it's purely German. Here there are somewhere smaller regions where Polish dominated, but this dominance was also not as conclusive as in West Prussia. You would have something like 60% of Poles and 40% of the Germans, right? So the Germans are in minority, but this is quite a huge minority. In addition, the region of Masuria had, of course, a huge population of Masurians who were ethnically Polish, but they were Protestant. So they didn't identify them exclusively with Germans or with Poles, right? They were a part both of the ethnicities. And for Lithuania, on the other side, so the border is up here. This is the small region. It's not seen very well on this map, probably. So the gray region, exactly here in Klaipėda, what became Lithuania afterwards, predominantly Lithuanian population. And what is also indicative in case of East Prussia is that there was, of course, because there was this huge mixture of populations in the borderlands and no really clear predominance of one or other group, the Polish and the Lithuanians got Germanized. Most of them were bilingual, could speak German, and sometimes could choose whether to report themselves in surveys as Germans or Polish or Lithuanians, respectively. Germans also got Polonized, and like if you see later statistics after the Second World War, when expulsions were happening, some of the Germans tried to claim they were actually Polish, and they could do that because they were bilingual, so they could kind of go through that and avoid being expelled out of the country. Now I then come to the 20th century. After the First World War, Germany lost a lot of areas in the east. Lithuania gained independence, and also part of Germany went to Lithuania, so this brown area here. Poland gained independence. It also gained access to the Baltic Sea, the so-called Polish corridor. This area here, East Prussia didn't have a lot of losses here, just this small piece. Mostly it was West Prussia and Posen, but East Prussia was now separated from the rest of the country. They could only have a connection by sea, or otherwise they would have to go through Poland. After the Second World War, the borders of both the Soviet Union and Poland shifted very much to the west, and the rest of East Prussia was now divided between Poland and USSR. And there was massive outflow of German population from the region, partially through the refugees who went away by will, partially the rest of the Germans were expelled in the first 5 years after the war. And this is an important thing that I will come later to again. After that, however, we can't really identify any major changes. So there was, of course, some minor mobility, but not that, you know, you totally exchange the population that is there. A lot of people stayed there like through generations. Now I come to our hypotheses. They were essentially what we expected in the very beginning when we started this project. To spoil your interest in the rest of my presentation, they don't really hold up. So the first hypothesis was based on the whole literature of cultural persistence and, you know, the huge lag in leveling out any differences. So our idea was then we should see that the population of the three different countries inside East Prussia should be more similar than outside of East Prussia. And the second hypothesis is that the legacy of East Prussia, like imperial legacies, might still persist, and East Prussia was more ethnically tolerant if we compare it to its neighbors. Also, it was clearly a much more conservative area, and it is also possible that there was some effect of superior German schooling as opposed to the Russian system that existed before the fall of both empires, so maybe there is also still some persistence in human capital. Now, why would we expect that the values can persist? Yeah, this is typically the very usual story of intergenerational transmission. So on the one hand, even in the areas where the population was mixed, not only Germans, there was a lot of cultural assimilation. Polish were Germanized, so they might take on the values of the Germans as well. And then if people stay in the area through generations, the values are transmitted from parents to children and so on. In addition, the system which was installed in all the three countries we're looking at, so Russia, at that time Soviet Union, Lithuania, which was incorporated into Soviet Union, and Poland, which was under huge influence of Soviet Union. So the system was quite similar in all of them. So it was not probably the time where you would expect a lot of possibilities to drift away. So most of the drift would probably have happened after the transition period in the last 25-30 years. And the regions are still very close to each other. We're still in this small region of former East Prussia, so maybe if there are still some ties that are out there, it might also help persistence of the values. Of course, there is a huge argument against any persistence, namely that there was total population exchange in Kaliningrad and Poland, not that much in Lithuania. The share of Germans was lower there in the first place, so the effect was also much smaller. Some also put forward the idea that some regions, like Kaliningrad, for example, were in quite special interest by the government. For example, Kaliningrad was a naval base, so military region. It doesn't really look like, it was really the whole region was a closed area, military area, so there was probably some part in the city where normal people didn't have access to, but for the rest of the region it was just a normal Soviet part. Now I come closer to my statistical analysis. So far I have gathered data on voting, so electoral data, and a little bit what could proxy human capital. So for electoral data I have presidential elections and parliamentary elections. I look at them as happening roughly at the same time. They of course do not coincide per se, but still. I have the data at the county level, which is the second level of administrative divisions. So in Russia it would be rayon, in Poland it would be powiat. With a total of 322 counties, and 14% of them are in former East Prussia. I don't look at the whole countries, I only look at the regions which are more or less neighboring. It is of course a bit tricky for Kaliningrad because it doesn't border Russia directly, so we look at Kaliningrad and Leningrad region, Pskov, Smolensk, Bryansk, Kursk. So everything that is close there, you will see it in a moment. So for electoral data we have the turnout, we also have the number of votes for each of the parties. Based on different online information, it is relatively easy to place the parties along their political spectrum and also ideology. So you can calculate the share of votes for example, conservative parties and nationalist parties. With nationalists, the idea is more ethnically tolerant regions would probably vote less for nationalists. It's not the best proxy that we can have, but still. It is a bit more tricky with president because you never really know what is the predisposition of one person with respect to political spectrum or ideology. I mostly used the data on which political party they were actually in or they supported openly to code them. I will not focus very much on presidential elections here. And for education proxy human capital, I used the number of schools in each of those counties, also the number of pupils in the schools, and I rather looked at their density, which is the number of schools per 1,000 inhabitants or number of pupils per 1,000 inhabitants. It's clearly not a very good measure for pupils. I still have to collect a bit more data to refer to a particular age group. Otherwise, the measure can just reflect differences in demographic structure. So to show it a little bit visually, that's the only time I will be talking about presidential elections. So the points here are for all of the counties that I have. The size of the point reflects the turnout. The larger the point, the larger the turnout. The color of the point reflects voting for conservative candidates. So green points are the most conservative, the largest share of conservative votes. Violet points, the lowest share of conservative votes. What you can immediately see from this picture is that the size, so this green line here is for East Prussia, and the size of the points are clearly much smaller than outside, right? So there's clearly much lower turnout. It's a bit harder to say much about how conservative East Prussia votes against the rest, but it's actually, it looks like they're voting more liberal, which is totally the opposite of what I would have expected, but I will talk about it later. There's a very close picture also for parliamentary elections, although it's probably not as drastic. It seems also that the turnout is a bit smaller, but you cannot really see whether it's really so or not. And it also looks a little bit like East Prussia is voting a bit less conservatively.
So to be sure I understand, the green points on the right are both former East Prussia and current Russia?
No, former East Prussia is here. So this is the rest of Russia. This has nothing to do with Germany. It was always Russia. And finally, for the pictures on the votes for nationalistic parties, well, again, looks like, so the green are higher share of votes for nationalistic parties. Looks a little bit like Kaliningrad is voting less nationalistically than here the southern regions, but not very much than the northern regions, so it's probably more about, you know, going north or maybe being closer to European Union than in East Prussia or outside. Also, but Poland seems to vote less nationalistically than here, for example. Now I come to probably the worst part of that, because this is my statistical analysis. Raise your hands, people who understand what's written here.
Not exactly.
Okay. So, I'll try to explain it very briefly. So essentially the idea is we have some outcome which is called Y here, for example, the turnout. And we want to decompose it into different effects we're interested in, primarily into being into the effect of a county being in East Prussia. And so this is what I have here. These are the three markers. This one is just a binary variable, can only be 1 or 0. It is 1 if the county is in Russia, inside East Prussia. This is Lithuania inside East Prussia. This is Poland inside East Prussia. This is then Lithuania outside East Prussia, or like generally Lithuania. And the effect here of Lithuania being inside East Prussia is an additional effect. Right? So you look at being Lithuania, and if you sum it up with this coefficient here, which we want to estimate the effect, you will see the, how Lithuania in East Prussia is different from Russia. And then I also have a bunch of effects I have to control for, because they might matter even if I'm not very much interested in them. Namely, I have to control for the area I'm looking at being a city, because normally you would expect cities have a higher turnout, for example. I also control for location based on the coordinates of the region, for altitude and also for distance from the border of East Prussia. And later on I also differentiate between being outside East Prussia, so going further from East Prussia, or being inside East Prussia and going deeper into East Prussia. And these beta coefficients are what I actually estimate. Right? So if I have a positive coefficient, there is a positive influence. Let's say if this is beta 3 is positive, then and the outcome is turned out, then Kaliningrad counties generally have higher turnout than the rest of Russia. Is the idea clear? Good. Now I come to the tables. So here I have different measures, different outcomes I'm looking at, either turnout, conservative votes, or nationalistic votes. I have a full sample which includes Russia, so all 322 observations, all 322 counties, or I kick Russia out, and I'm left with 164 counties in Poland and Lithuania. So these are the coefficients here. You then have to look at what is in brackets here. The stars means that statistically speaking we can tell this coefficient is not equal to 0. So there is indeed some effect. 1 star is less certainty. There is still some 10% probability that we are wrong, and it is still a 0. 2 stars is 5%, and 1 star, what we call highly significant, means with 99% probability, when we say it is not 0, we are also correct. So I will start with trivial stuff. Cities here indeed have higher turnout, they vote less conservatively and also less nationalistically. Russia is boring. There is nothing going on here, so there are some positive coefficients, but we cannot say if they are not just a mistake and it's just a 0, no effect. Lithuania and Poland, in general, have lower turnout than Russia. But you can only see lower turnout in East Prussia against the rest of the country. In Poland, if you look at the smaller sample. Right. So the second thing is that Lithuania and Poland generally vote much more liberally than Russia. So we have negative coefficients here. Also, Lithuania votes on average much more liberally than Poland does. But the interesting effect is that Lithuania tends to vote more conservatively in East Prussia than in the rest of the country, which is in line with what we would have expected, actually, with our hypothesis. But in Poland, it's the other way around. They vote more liberally inside East Prussia than outside. The other funny thing is, if you test statistically whether Lithuania and Poland are the same within East Prussia, you can't really tell them apart. But, well, you can actually clearly tell them apart outside, right? So in this case, this is essentially the only case where our hypothesis, both of them, hold, that Lithuania and Poland are more similar to each other inside of East Prussia, but the background of that is not that both vote more conservatively, but that Lithuania is more conservative in East Prussia, Poland is more liberal in East Prussia, but it is generally much more conservative than Lithuania. So it's a very complex combination here. And I will say a few words about why I think it's the case with Poland here. Also, we can see that Poland and Lithuania generally vote less nationalistically than Russia does, but again, the Russian case is of course quite tricky. You have one major party which can be coded both nationalistic and conservative, and most of the people vote for this party. This is also why I some accents rely much more on this smaller sample where I only have Lithuania and Poland.
How many Lithuanian former
That's
Russian
part
counties
of
are
the
there?
problem, only 5. So there are 41 counties in Poland altogether, and 5 of them are in East Prussia. Well, I think this might also be why it might be a bit better to look at the smaller sample, because like if you have all the 325 counties, the share of Lithuanian East Prussia there is just negligible. So you might not be able to find any significant results there just because of the number. Right, so, and where was I? Right, and Poland votes less nationalistically in East Prussia, which is kind of also in line with our hypothesis, but it's the other way around with Lithuania. I still need to think about why exactly. And one more table, then I'm done with that. The education data, I will focus primarily on schooling here. Not that there is really much interesting going on here. Russia seems to have even less schools or like lower school density in East Prussia than outside, but it's not the case for Poland. Poland is like in line with our hypothesis, and yes, generally Lithuania and Poland seem to have lower school density than Russia does. Probably it has to do with the Soviet politics of education system.
And you also have ethnic Russians moving into Lithuania?
Yes, not as much as in Estonia and Latvia. So in Lithuania, it's mostly personnel for authorities, so for the government, some military stuff and scientific stuff for the plans of industrialization that were going there. But the influx was relatively limited. Also, the Lithuanian population had quite high natural growth. So the Lithuanians were still a clear majority. There was like, I'm not sure, I don't have the number in my head right now, but definitely less than 10% of Russians in the country. And they were very dispersed, so you wouldn't really see any effect there. So I now come to the discussion. As I said, our hypotheses do not really hold up universally. The persistence is clearly broken in the areas with demographic discontinuity. There seems to be some more persistence in Lithuania, where the exchange of population was not that strong, and this is what I think the main reason is. For example, very different voting patterns. Well, firstly, there is already some research on turnout. Simon and Urbach show, so Urbach actually does it for Poland, that in the borderlands with expulsions of population, the turnout is less. They interpret it as lower civic engagement. Also in terms of liberal voting, I think it has to do with the demography of those who were moving into the area after the expulsion of the Germans. For example, in Poland, these were mostly younger people, but this is something I have to research more a bit, to research a bit more. Well, right, and again, for schooling, I don't really see any effect here. I would also love to look at education levels. I'm very close to conclusion now. I just wanted to show you one map I found really interesting when I was preparing all this stuff. So I tried to take Russia out and zoom into Poland and Lithuania, and this is nationalistic votes, and what you can see here, again, the purple points are lower shares for nationalistic parties, and the interesting thing for me here is that the border for less nationalistic voting here is not exactly East Prussia, it is much more where the ethnic Germans were, or here ethnic Russians and Belarusians. And this is something I find really intriguing, especially because the Germans are not there anymore. They all moved out. And I think it might also, in a broader sense, put a question towards all this literature on cultural persistence and so on, because like when you say, okay, we see more liberal voting on the German side of contemporary Poland, is it about the German values persisting through the period, or is it about the selection bias in who went to the place actually when the Germans were expelled and the area was populated again? So for my next steps, I will conclude with that then. I would really love to look at more geographically disaggregated data. There is also a third level of administrative division, and I'm currently collecting the local council elections, which I will be able to have at that level. I will also try to see if I have other statistics like education on that level too. I'm not totally sure about that. And I would of course be interested in other measures, the level of education, for example, like what's the share of people who have higher education, not just schooling, because schooling is mostly universal. And as an economist, I'm of course very interested in the questions of economic geography. Is there any persistence or change in the distribution of economic activity? So I could look at income or infrastructure here. Infrastructure is something that is very likely to persist. You don't exchange railroads every 10 years. I personally would be super interested in looking at trade, but this is also the most complicated thing to gather on the county level. And because of the picture I just showed you before, I would really be interested in looking not at the border of East Prussia, but actually at where the majority of Germans were. And finally, I understand that voting is probably not the best proxy for attitudes. You don't always vote exactly in a way that you think things should be, and every party is just, you know, it can, you know, enhance your or represent your values in some certain area, but not in others. So I would be really interested in using some survey data, but there is a huge problem with that because there is not enough geographic coverage at the level that we need. But if you have any knowledge about any data out there, I would really be happy to know. That's it. I really done it quite fast. Thank you very much.